Here's Alex O'Connor to explain why he is so interested in Jesus.
I talk about this and I debate this all the time, and I debate whether Jesus was God or whether he even claimed to be God and all of this kind of stuff.
Jesus certainly never explicitly said that he was God. He said a few things that apologists interpret as implying that he is God, but you have to apply some pretty creative hermeneutical contortionism to draw that conclusion. The stuff that he said that most heavily implies divinity is in the Gospel of John, which was the Gospel that was written last, and if the quotes from that are accurate, one wonders why the other three Gospel authors never saw fit to mention it. That seems like an awfully important detail to leave out.
But for me, the undeniable thing is that there's this extraordinary historical figure who did something extraordinary. And there's something really weird that happened that caused a bunch of people to start quite early on worshipping him, which is a very strange thing to do to a human being, especially in a Jewish culture.
How early on are we talking, and what do you mean by worship? I think Jesus believed that he was the prophesied Messiah, and he wasn't the first person to believe that about himself and gain a following. That's not particularly strange. Jesus isn't even the only person in the New Testament who is portrayed as having a following. Chapter 8 of Acts mentions Simon the magician, who boasted that he was someone great, and all the people, both high and low, gave him their attention and exclaimed, "This man is rightly called the great power of God." They followed him because he had amazed them for a long time with his sorcery.
And so, to me, getting at the Gospels from a scholarly perspective helps me to understand who this historical figure was. That's the thing I'm really interested in, almost in the way that somebody might be really interested in Julius Caesar or in whether the Iliad, whether the Trojan War really happened and whether that kind of stuff. I sort of take this approach.
That feels
to
to me like that was your point of entry.
Yes. Yeah. But
you've had such a journey and you've met so many amazing people and you've debated so many different angles and things.
Yeah.
Where's it led you to?
It's led me to, I used to be quite on board with the new atheism stuff.
Christopher Hitchens was a lot of fun, but something that has sketched me out about the new atheist movement is that it is largely based in paranoia about Muslims after 2001. Hitchens, of course, was not exempted from that.
I've spoken about this a lot on my show.
What does that mean?
You know, like the sort of Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, it was really popular, the debates that they were doing, they called it new atheism.
Yeah.
And it was this body of like atheist thought with the God delusion, this kind of stuff, which was really popular. And it had this sort of quite strident, debate me bro kind of attitude. And I was really swept up by that. I thought that was really exciting and cool. And I was beginning to sort of shake that off and grow up a bit, essentially. And then running the podcast, what I've realized is this is far more interesting and intricate. And I would say plausible than I'd given it credit for before.
When I first heard about atheism, I immediately thought it seemed much more sensible than theism, but I still thought maybe it might be possible for God to exist. The more I looked into it, the more I came to realize that the existence of God is not just implausible, but outright incoherent. The more I listened to Christians make their case for Christianity, the more problems I began to see with it. Not only did the Gospels have all kinds of problems of which I was previously unaware when I first started hearing Christians out, the very concept of God seemed more and more self-contradictory the more I learned about the theology and philosophy behind it.
So, I'm still not a Christian. Some people say to me, like,
it's a funny word though, that anyway.
Yeah.
Like I'm less and less certain about the word.
Yeah.
You know what somebody said to me the other day? You're like this. The period of greatest growth ever in the history of the church was from 33 AD to 350.
Yeah.
And during this time, there was no church buildings.
Yeah.
No sermons.
Yeah.
But no singing.
Yeah.
And no Bible.
Yeah.
And like we get very tied up in all of those things and the labels and even the phrase Christian.
Yeah.
It's like I'm not sure where, for me it feels quite like man-made, these sort of words.
Yeah. And that is where I can definitely agree with, especially a Christian of your kind, which is to say someone who will say that and recognize that. Because some people place a lot of stock, particularly Catholics, they place a lot of stock in church tradition and the traditions that developed after Nicaea.
If you ask some apologists how they know that what they believe about God is accurate, they'll say because it's consistent with the Bible. But how did people know that what they believed was revelation from God really was before there ever was a Bible? Maybe apologists would say that Christians knew that what they believed about Jesus was accurate because he fulfilled Old Testament prophecies, even though he didn't. But even if he did, how did the folks who wrote the earliest books of the Old Testament know that what they believed to be revelation from God really was revelation from God, as opposed to delusions? They didn't have any pre-existing scripture to consult.
And I look at that with a similar kind of man-made skepticism. And I think to myself, it also gives me license to, when I look at the New Testament and I think, some scholars think that Paul maybe didn't write that letter and that's a big problem. But for someone like me, it's like, who cares? If I decide that Paul didn't write 1 Timothy, then I'll just look at the rest of it and I'll try to work out what came between the lines.
The consensus among New Testament scholars is that several of the epistles attributed to Paul were not actually written by Paul, but this is only a problem if you infer that Paul is any more reliable or authoritative than the forgers who tried to pass their own writings off as his. Maybe the authors weren't even trying to be deceptive, and they were writing under Paul's name the same way all of the Tom Clancy novels written after Tom Clancy died are not trying to pass themselves off as actually having been written by Tom Clancy. Maybe Paul had become more of a publishing brand.
A good friend of mine said to me once, when there's all this discussion about whether we have the real words of Jesus and whether the Gospels are accurate and whether it's all apocryphal stories, he said that because these were written from early church traditions, Jesus was a real man who was doing real things, we can still know a lot about the character of Jesus. He said, imagine if, for example, have you heard of the Churchillian drift, where quotes get attributed to Churchill, even though he never said them? Same thing happens with C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
And he said, imagine if the only information you had historically about Churchill was a book of apocryphal quotes that he never actually said, but that people believed he said. You'd still get a pretty good picture of the kind of person Winston Churchill was.
You'd get a pretty good picture of the kind of person people thought he was. Apocryphal quotes can entrench misconceptions about a person.
Worst case scenario, you still get a pretty good...
You're still getting an image. And so
you're getting the person's reputation. That can be pretty far off from what the person was actually like.
I'm really interested in the scholarly stuff and well, did Jesus really say that? Was this an interpolation? Blah, blah, blah. Is this a translation thing? But the thing that's most fascinating to me below all of that is who was this guy and what was he doing to cause all of this? Even if it's a bunch of confusion and confused timelines, and even if some stories got in there that shouldn't have got in there.
There was also clearly fudging of the details to make it look like Jesus' life conformed to prophecy, or how people at the time interpreted prophecy. For example, there was fudging of the details to make it look as though the Pharisees bore more responsibility than the Romans for the crucifixion because the early Christians wanted to avoid persecution.
The fact that this scramble to write all of this down and turn it into...
Even with the drift.
Exactly. It's still
I think
extremely interesting.
If we could time travel, you would be one of the rough gang. So would I. I don't think you'd be, even though you kind of the headlines of you is professor sort of Oxford. Well, are you a professor?
I'm not a professor, no.
You're very clever. Do you know what I mean? That could potentially put you into the Pharisee type thing. Right. But you are the opposite. You are what you would have been running wild with Jesus, I think.
Yeah. I like that.
And also, I sort of always got the feel with Jesus. He loved the challenge. He loved the riposte. He loved the mental, verbal, theological challenges.
There's a lot of jousting,
He's portrayed as loving it. I don't think this portrayal is so much an accurate depiction of Jesus rebutting challenges as it is the gospel authors rebutting challenges to their religion and attributing these arguments to Jesus to give them authority.
Yeah, a lot
of jousting and brilliant sort of responses that have never been better. You know, whether it's in should we pay our taxes to Caesar or not? The Pharisees are trying to trip him up.
Mm-hmm.
This passage about rendering unto Caesar that which is Caesar's looks very much to me like an example of the New Testament authors trying to make Christianity look like it is not at all a threat to Roman authority to avoid persecution.
And sort of that response of just whose head is on the coin? Pay to him and pay to God what is God. It's sort of brilliant.
Yeah, there's a brilliant...
And I would think that I see a beautiful alignment, actually. I think if we would go back in time travel, you'd be running wild with him.
I think if you had a time machine and went back to meet Jesus, you'd be very disappointed.
Well, if the science ever gets there and we manage to go back in time, when people say, where would you go?
Yeah, where would you go? Come on, what would you do?
Of course you'd go to meet Jesus.
I love it. What point? Where would you go? Would you go after the resurrection, or would you want to be there at the beginning? What about in the 17 years?
That's interesting. I think that the moment that you'd want to witness, if you could only have 5 minutes, would be the moment of the crucifixion. And the reason is that you would see that this was a man, the crucifixion happened, you would see whether the curtain tore, whether the sky opened, all of that kind of stuff. And it would give you all of that.
But they keep finding evidence for I think in the sort of, the star stuff and the They said there was
like the solar eclipse.
The solar eclipse. I've actually done it. It's the exact kind of like
That's really interesting, isn't it?
Really interesting.
There was no solar eclipse during Jesus' crucifixion. There may have been a lunar eclipse that night, but a lunar eclipse would obviously not account for the passage in Matthew that says that the sun went dark from noon until 3 p.m. I'm a little surprised that Alex nodded along with this long debunked nonsense.
And also that moment is kind of also to see the first ever Roman Christian. Well,
yes.
Yeah. The centurion truly son of God.
Yeah.
This man is the son of God.
Matthew 27:54 says that the centurion said that after seeing the darkness and tearing of the curtain and a bunch of people rising from their graves, but the idea that Jesus was therefore the Son of God is a total non sequitur. As Christopher Hitchens said,
"After all, Lazarus was raised, never said a word about it. The daughter of Jairus was raised, didn't say a thing about what she'd been through. And the Gospels tell us that at the time of the crucifixion, all the graves in Jerusalem opened and their occupants wandered around the streets to greet. So that it seems the resurrection was something of a banality at the time. Not all of those people clearly were divinely conceived. So I'll give you all the miracles and you'll still be left exactly where you are now, holding an empty sack."
Also, doesn't the term Son of God seem to imply a distinct entity from God? This also sounds like it may have been shoehorned in to make Jesus look more like the future ruler prophesied in 2 Daniel chapter 7. God says that a descendant of King David will establish a kingdom that lasts forever, and I will be his father and he will be my son. This is still pretty hard to square with the fact that Jesus didn't establish any kingdom, let alone one which lasts forever. You have to come up with some abstruse exegesis to make this fit with what actually happened.
But then part of me
That's interesting you go to that moment. That's kind of cool.
But part of me would say, although, yeah, you want to see the resurrection, you want to see part of me wants to say I would just like to meet him walking along during his ministry and just say, listen, man, I've got 5 minutes.
Yes.
Who are you? Like,
yes. Are you the real deal?
Messiah, are you God? Are you claiming to be God? Like, that's what I'd want to do. I'd want to ask that question.
It would certainly be great to get some confirmation as to whether Jesus really believed himself to be God incarnate. It's far from clear that he ever said that, and it takes a lot of pretty tortured hermeneutics to interpret anything he did say as meaning that.
And, I mean, where would you go in Jesus' life?
So,
5 minutes.
So it's so interesting, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I think... So, I mean, if you think of the biblical, so there are a lot of people that did get that chance and did it come exactly for that purpose.
Mm-hmm.
You know, say, I mean, one bit you might not have noticed that I really like is John the Baptist's relationship with Jesus. We kind of touched on it, but there's a really nice moment where if you think if anyone in the Jesus orbit is going to believe in him, it's John the Baptist.
It's interesting that Jesus gets baptized by John the Baptist because if Jesus is God, why would God need to be baptized?
Mm-hmm. Known him from birth, kicking inside my mother's stomach whenever Jesus walked in the room. Like, I know this guy is a real deal. I'm baptizing the River Jordan saying there was one is coming after me is like, you know, I know.
Mm-hmm.
And yet when he was in Herod's prison and he gets a chance to get a message to his disciples, the one thing he says is go back to Yeshua and just ask him, you really are who you say you are.
Who did Jesus say he was? It didn't seem at all to me that he ever said he was God. I think he believed himself to be the Messiah because he explicitly said that he heralded the coming of the kingdom of heaven, which more closely resembles what the Messiah is supposed to do. But the Messiah is never portrayed in the Old Testament as being God himself.
Is it you?
And I love that because, like, if even John the Baptist had doubts, because of he's like being tortured and in a brutal prison and like we're human, you know, then I can have doubts. And it's like, he's been a real hero of mine, actually, John the Baptist.
Me too. I think he's my favorite person.
Well, it's interesting you say that.
So,
if I were John the Baptist, I would wonder why this guy who says he's some kind of great religious figure, like a prophet or a Messiah, would come to lowly old me to be baptized. It would be like if the Pope were asking to be baptized.
I'd be interested in what I like about him is that everyone always, Jesus says there's no one being greater.
Yes.
He is the number one in the prophets.
That's
number
right.
one. And I always think, like, we think to be number one in life, you've got to be like a leader. You got to be like, I would think Moses or one of these people, like on top of the mountain, the big beard, the loud voice, the authority. It's how we're brought up to think these are our people in our lives who are the leaders.
Mm-hmm.
And yet it was the rough one who lived off the land
Camel
and was
skin.
wild and just loved this Yeshua character. Yeah.
Yeah.
And ate nothing but locusts, the one kosher bug.
And he said, no one better. Why do you like?
I think he's fascinating because he seems to be this sort of precursor to Jesus in a weird way. He's the introduction to Jesus. There's a bit of mystery as to who he was and why he was baptizing and why he found his way into the wilderness and what it means to preach a baptism for the repentance of sins and why Jesus would need to undergo that.
Yeah, it's almost like it doesn't make any sense. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.